are you complaining about?
Hello, everyone. I'm Fran Burwell. I'm a distinguished fellow here at the Atlantic Council. We're delighted us launch this new report from the Pew Research Center and to join with us in discussing European perspectives on the future of Europe. Today's discussion comes at a particularly meaningful time. Almost exactly 1 year ago today, on June 23rd, 2016, the citizens of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, creating a new political reality across Europe. At that time, with the economy stagnating and the apparent rise of populist and in some cases extremist political forces, Europe seemed to be overwhelmed by its challenges. Indeed, last year's Pew poll revealed a significant doubt in Europe about the value of closer integration and about the value of the European project. During this past year, we've seen a very lively debate about the future of Europe and a series of elections that have challenged the inevitability of populism while making clear, however, that it is still a very potent political force. From a narrow defeat for the hard right in the Austrian election and a more definitive defeat of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, to the political earthquake that has hit France in the form of Emmanuel Macron and En Marche, upending established political parties and achieving a strong victory less than a year after the creation of En Marche. It looks as though Europe may be on the rebound, but is it? The economy is only growing at 1.5%. And despite electoral defeats, populism continues to attract a good number of people across Europe. Terrorism seems to be striking with increased regularity. And for those of you who don't know, just as we came in, we heard there may have been an attack at the central station in Belgium, in Brussels. We have the Brexit negotiations, which started yesterday, and a recent British election, which I think left us all with more questions than answers. And in the United States, long a steadying element in the European environment, has become much less predictable. So how do Europeans see themselves and their future now? Has their mood changed from the rather downbeat poll of last summer's Pew report? We're delighted today to welcome Richard Wickes to present the latest Pew Research Center survey, which takes the pulse of the European public at this important time. These results allow us to assess the impact of Brexit 1 year later and to get insights into what kind of future Europeans see for themselves. I would point out that here at the Atlantic Council, where the transatlantic relationship is core to our mission, we believe that understanding what the Europeans are thinking is a key element in trying to build a strong future for that relationship. I'm going to stop here so we can get going on this report, but I want to encourage everyone in the audience and online to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. And on that note, let me welcome Dr. Wickes to the stage, Director of Global Attitudes Research at the Pew Research Center. He's the author of numerous Pew reports on Europe and other regions. After he presents the poll, I'll be back with our panelists for a further discussion with you, the audience. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Fran, and thanks very much to the Atlantic Council for hosting this. Thanks to all the panelists for being here, and thanks to all of you for being here as well. I'm really excited to have a chance to share with you the results of our new survey in Europe. At the Pew Research Center over the last few years, we've been tracking European public attitudes about the European project sort of broadly. And as you can imagine, we've seen a lot of ups and downs, often more downs than ups, frankly. But this year's survey has some, I think, positive news in it. People are feeling a little bit better about the economy. They're feeling a little bit better about the European Union, but there's signs of frustration as well. People aren't entirely satisfied with everything that Brussels is doing, and they're not entirely content with the political situation in their countries either. So what I'll do is I'll walk through some of the key findings of the survey with you, and then I look forward to the discussion afterwards. So before I get into the findings, let me tell you just a little bit about the Pew Research Center and who we are and what we do. We've been around over 2 decades now. We're funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust, but we do receive funding from other foundations and sources as well. As it says here, we're nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy, so we don't take stances on political or policy issues of any sort. We like to call ourselves a fact tank rather than a think tank because we put such an emphasis on data and empirical information. And you can see some of the research topics that we're involved in there. I'll put in a plug for our website, which is pewresearch.org. All of our reports are there, things like op-eds, blog posts, interactives, and increasingly we have some good interactive features on the website. And if you're a number cruncher, you can also download the raw data yourself and use it in your own analysis. And if after today you have any questions about any aspect of our work, feel free to follow up with me directly, and I'd be very happy to point you in the direction of something we do that might be relevant to the work that you do. And then just briefly on the methodology for the survey. This was conducted in March and April in 10 European countries. Almost 10,000 people were interviewed. These are all nationally representative samples, so that means the demographic profile of the people we surveyed looks essentially like the demographic profile of the country's population. And you can see the margin of error there, which is, again, pretty typical for a nationally representative survey. And happy to talk more about the methodology or how we go about doing this type of work during Q&A if you're interested. So let's look first at how people are feeling about the economy in these 10 EU nations that we surveyed. So this shows you the trend over the last few years in these nations, and this is the percentage of people in each country who say that the current economic situation in that country is good. And a couple things about this slide. One is, as you can see, in several countries we've seen significant improvements over the last few years, especially since 2016, in Northern Europe in particular, but also in places like France and Spain and elsewhere we've seen an improvement since 2016. Now, as you can see as well, there are big differences across these countries in terms of how people feel about their economic situation. So again, in Northern Europe, you tend to see much more positive views than you see in some of the Southern European countries that we survey. Even in places like France and Spain where we've seen an improvement, overall economic attitudes are still pretty negative. And then you've got Greece down at the bottom, consistently very, very, very low ratings for the economy in Greece over the last few years. No surprise to anyone, but still I think a striking finding that it's been either 1 or 2% in every survey we've conducted there over the last few years. So we've seen attitudes towards the economy improve somewhat over the last year. We've also seen views of the EU improve in many nations. As you can see, in most of the countries we surveyed, the percentage of people who have a favorable opinion of the EU has increased since 2016. The one exception is Italy, also the one place where we didn't see an improvement in terms of how people feel about the economy in their country. So, but for the most part, pretty significant increases in terms of favorable attitudes towards the EU. However, that doesn't mean people are pleased with the EU on every issue. There are mixed views across these countries in terms of how people feel the EU is dealing with economic issues, for example. As you can see, very negative attitudes in terms of how Brussels is handling economic issues in Greece, Italy, Spain, some of the countries that really struggled with the Euro crisis. More positive in the Netherlands and Germany and Poland and some of the countries that did better over the last few years economically. Now on refugees, we tend to see more negative assessments of the job performance of the EU. In every country we surveyed, you've got at least half or more saying that they're dissatisfied with the job that Brussels is doing handling refugee issues. And that view is particularly common in Greece, Italy, Sweden, some of the countries that have been impacted by this issue in particular. So overall views of the EU are up, but there's still a lot of discontent in how the EU is dealing with certain issues, especially the economy and refugees. Another thing we wanted to do in this study is look at how people are thinking about Brexit 1 year after the vote. So one of the things that we see is that people still think, we asked a similar question last year, and this year they still think it's going to be a bad thing for the EU. This is the predominant view in every single country we surveyed. As you can see, the Brits themselves agree. About 7 in 10 say they think they're leaving the EU is going to be bad for the European Union, and that's the most common view overwhelmingly in all the countries that we surveyed. Now, will it be bad for the UK? Here again, the prevailing view is yes, Brexit is going to be bad for the UK, although the numbers here aren't quite as high in terms of people saying it's going to be a bad thing. And if you look at the Greeks, actually, a plurality there says they actually think it will be a good thing for the UK. And in the UK itself, people were divided in our survey, almost equal numbers saying they think it'll be a good thing and a bad thing, or a bad thing for their country. And as you can imagine, you see some pretty big ideological differences in Britain with people on the right, supporters of the Conservative Party, much more likely to say that they think it will be a good thing for Britain. Now, we wanted to see what people think about the possibility of their own country leaving the EU. So we asked them 2 questions about this. Would you like to have a vote here in our country on leaving the EU? And then would you actually like to leave the EU? And I think the results are pretty interesting. You've got significant numbers, half or more in most of these countries, saying that they would like to have a vote on whether to leave the EU. But the percentage of people saying they'd actually like to leave is pretty small, right? No more than roughly a third or so in any of these countries saying they'd actually like to leave the EU. But they would like to have a vote on it. They'd like to have their voices heard on this issue. And it fits in with some of the things we've seen in terms of trends in Europe, I think, in terms of more interest in direct democracy. The 5-star movement probably highlights that more than anything else. But we see it in other countries as well, a desire to express their views on this, even if they don't actually want to leave the EU. Now, we wanted to look also in this study at how people see the balance of power between Brussels and their own national capital. So we asked them about a series of issues and whether they would like to see their own government or the EU decide these types of issues. And as you can see, people want more power brought back into their own countries when it comes to issues like the migration of non-EU citizens into their country, migration of EU citizens into their country. In particular, on both those issues, you see pretty big majorities across the board saying that we'd like to see our country have more decision-making power over that issue. And even on something like international trade agreements, which has been a power that Brussels has had for a pretty long time, nonetheless there you've got most people saying, I'd like to see that power brought back to our own country. So, again, something we've seen in different ways in our surveys over the years is that people want more power brought back from Brussels. Germany, obviously playing a bigger and bigger role in many ways within the EU. Big elections coming up in Germany this fall. So in this survey, that's one of the things we wanted to look at, is how do people within the EU view Germany and its leadership and its role within the EU. Now, when we ask a basic favorability question, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of Germany? In 9 of the 10 countries, most people said yes. Greece was the one exception. Greece is, on a whole variety of issues, has pretty negative views about Germany. But in most places, there were generally positive attitudes about Germany as a nation. Now, when we asked about Angela Merkel specifically, you got somewhat more mixed reviews. On balance, still more positive than negative, but as you can see, it varies a lot across these countries. Places like the Netherlands and Sweden, France, the UK, a lot of confidence in Angela Merkel. Greece, overwhelmingly, again, very negative towards her, negative towards Germany as a whole. So, on balance, Merkel gets pretty good ratings in Europe, but it varies a lot from country to country. What about Germany's power within the EU? Do they have too much influence, about the right amount, or not enough influence within the EU? And again, you can see a wide variety of views on this question across the countries that we surveyed. Greece, overwhelmingly, Italy, Spain, Poland. In these countries, people seem to say that there's just too much influence from Germany within the EU. The Netherlands, Sweden, they're okay with the amount of influence that Germany has. And if you look down at the bottom of the screen, you can see the results from Germany, which look a little bit different from what others around Europe say, right? In Germany, you've only got 10% saying we've got too much influence. You've got 26% saying that we could use more influence, which is a much higher number than you see in these other countries. So overall, Germans, as you might expect, see this issue a little bit differently than their neighbors in Europe. And then one other topic that we wanted to look at in this survey is views about political parties in each of these countries. So in each country, we read people a list of some of the major parties in their nation and asked them whether they have a favorable or unfavorable opinion. And a few things I think stuck out to me about these results. One is we asked, I believe it was about 42 different parties across these 10 countries, and only 5 of them had positive reviews. There were only 5 in which a majority of people in the country said, I have a favorable opinion of that party. And the other thing that was interesting is that there's very little support in this survey for right-wing populist parties. Of course, a subject that's gotten a lot of attention over the last few years, but this survey would suggest that there's been no huge groundswell or increasing degree of support for these right-wing parties. They get pretty low numbers for the most part in our survey. So if you want to look at the results country by country, you can see that overall the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, these places have parties that are in positive territory. All 5 of these parties that get favorable ratings are in those 3 countries, including, if you look at Germany, both of the 2 major political parties get positive reviews. Now, one caveat, of course, is this data is down, a few weeks old, so things may have moved a little bit, but I think it gives you a pretty good sense of how people assess the parties in each of these countries. The Conservatives in the UK got the highest numbers. Parties in Poland pretty closely clustered together. If you look at the right-wing parties in the Netherlands, the Swedish Democrats, AFD, UKIP, pretty low ratings for all of those, so not especially good numbers for right-wing populists. Same question in the 5 other countries, and you can see no party among all these we tested is in positive territory. Again, been a lot of activity in these countries since we asked the question, so it's possible that some of these might be higher now. En Marche was certainly the highest in terms of ratings in France. Fidesz, the ruling party in Hungary, comes pretty close to breaking that 50% threshold. 5-star movements getting higher ratings than anybody else in Italy. Greece, again, sort of stands out for the glum political mood there. Poor ratings for the most part for all the political parties we tested there. And then if you look at the right-wing parties again, National Front, etc., pretty low ratings for the right-wing populists across most of these countries. So that's just a quick summary. The report's got a lot more findings, a lot more data there. Again, I think we see some positive signs in terms of people feeling better about the economy, feeling a little bit better about the EU. But it's also clear that people continue to have some frustrations about the political status quo, whether that's in Brussels or within their own country. I'll leave it there and then look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
So let me invite the panelists, if you can sit there.
Yeah.
Let me invite the panelists to come up. I'm going to quickly introduce everybody, and then I'm going to come back to you, Richard, and start the discussion with you. But I've already introduced you, so let me introduce first Benjamin Haddad, who is a research fellow at the Hudson Institute. He has focused for a long time on the EU and US policy towards Europe, and he was for a while an advisor to the Macron campaign, but he says now he has returned to being an analyst. Ambassador Alexandra Hall. She is a senior fellow now here at our Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. She was the British ambassador to Georgia from 2013 to 2016 and is a long-serving UK diplomat. And then, last but certainly not least, we have our distinguished fellow here at the Council, Dan Fried. In looking at Dan's bio, I suddenly realized that he'd held just about every single post that is of importance in making US policy towards Europe. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. He was the Senior Director for Europe and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council. He was ambassador to a country that both he and I care a great deal about, which is Poland, which is one of your odder countries, I would say. And most recently, he was in charge of sanctions policy, which, although not specifically European, is something that he worked with the Europeans on quite extensively. So, Richard, let me come back to you. What was the most surprising thing in the data to you?
You know, I think that the political parties finding maybe in some ways isn't very surprising, that people don't like political parties. Established political parties have been getting poor reviews for a while. But if you just sort of stand back and look at this big graph we've got in that report, and look how few are across that 50% threshold, and to me that tells you something about the disconnect between the parties and the people, and something about how unhappy people are with some of the major political institutions within their country.
Well, let me kind of circle around that a little bit, because one of the findings that you had was the one about the referendum and the desirability of having a referendum. And I have to admit that when I first saw that, I thought, well, you know, some pollster calls up and they say, do you want a referendum? And you say, oh, why not? Yeah, sure, we'll have a referendum. So I wasn't quite sure, but when you couple that with the lack of respect for political parties, does that make you take the referendum comment more seriously, or do you think these are linked in any way in terms of how Europeans? There does seem to be this enormous distance between Europeans and their political systems.
I think that's right. You may see some connection between the fact that people are so dissatisfied with traditional political institutions, whether they're in Brussels or their political parties within their own country, and that's driving some desire for more direct democracy. To put in a plug for some research we'll have out in the fall, we're going to ask some questions about exactly that topic on, how do you feel about representative democracy, how do you feel about direct democracy, and those kind of things. So stay tuned and we'll have a little bit more on that.
All right. Okay. Well, that will be very interesting. In both Europe and the United States, or?
All around the world, actually.
All around the world. Okay. Yeah. All right. Benjamin, let me come to you. The first few slides of this were very optimistic, pro-Europe message. And then the last few were this disenchantment with established political. What does the French election, how does that fit in this? Macron had a very anti-establishment but pro-Europe message. Why did that work?
I think that worked for a few reasons. There are a lot of very striking things that happened in that French election, as you mentioned earlier. One of them, for example, if you look at the second round of the presidential election, you have Emmanuel Macron versus Marine Le Pen. The Republican candidate arrives third. The Socialist candidate, the incumbent party in power, arrives fifth. Yeah. These are the two parties that have structured the French political life for the last half century. And they get swept away. To give you just one piece of data, the Socialist Party goes from 284 to less than 30 seats in parliament. And I think Macron saw a few things that happened within European and within Western democracies and managed to ride on them. I think one of the things that he saw is that the traditional right-left divide, as it has structured our democracies, is more and more obsolete. I mean, we've been talking a lot these last few years, including the United States, about this new divide between open versus closed, globalist versus nationalist, however you want to call it. And the problem with the way the French debate was structured, I think that's something that, to his credit, Trump saw as well before many others in the United States. The way the right-left divide was structured is that you had within the Republicans and the Socialists inside the parties deep divisions over Europe, over globalization, over all these issues that have taken center stage. So Macron did the opposite of Trump. He unabashedly embraced the open side. He's liberal, social liberal, pro-free market reform, pro-European. You might say globalist. You could discuss the term. But he managed to, create his political offer, shape it according to this new divide, because he didn't come from either the socialist or the Republican. The second thing that comes back directly to your question is that he has managed to embrace the anti-establishment rhetoric. For all the talk about the rise of populism, I think when we talk about it, we conflate two distinct phenomena. There's extremist political ideologies of the right and the left, anti-globalization, anti-Europe, but there's also the desire for change and renewal and you might call the anti-establishment feeling. And when Macron did is he managed to dissociate the two. He was once again the pro-open candidate, but embracing the anti-establishment. He explicitly ran against the failures of both political parties, both establishment parties, to reform the country. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people voted for him is precisely because he created his own political party a year ago. He had never ran for office. He's 39 years old, worked in the private sector for a while. Now, don't get me wrong, he's clearly a product of the French establishment, went to elite schools, worked for Rothschild, was a Hollande staffer. But he did deliver on his promise to renew the French political class. If you look at the profiles of the people who were elected on Sunday, I mean, the vast majority of them have never ran for office, were civil society people. And it's stunning. I mean, it's even more stunning than the presidential election in a way. Sometimes really well-known establishment incumbent figures have been beaten by margins of 20 points by complete political unknowns. So that really shows you if you want to make it negative, the disdain that the French had for their political establishment, and he managed to embrace it without being hijacked by the extremist ideology. And one last point I would make about the way he talked about the European Union, which I think was very novel in this campaign. If you look, there's a very interesting speech he gave in London in February, I think, in front of French expats. He's, in general, very popular with the 2.5 million French expats that we have today. And he talked about Brexit. And his analysis of Brexit was to say, you're never going to win a campaign when on the one side you have people who are making existential, values-based, identity-based case for independence. And on the other side, shy technocrats who are trying to make a sort of boring cost-benefit analysis saying, well, we're better off in because we're going to get like 0.5 points of GDP or something. Right. You have to make it ideological. You have to make it about values, identity, about the very nature of France. And that is very counterintuitive because Europe is a favorite punching ball of a scapegoat of the French political elite, left and right. When they want to sort of deflect, like you would do when you hire McKinsey to fire people. When you want to do unpopular reform, you say it's because of the European Union. So he did exactly the opposite, and I think so far it has worked.
No, the Brussels made me do it line. So I want to bring in Alexa to talk a little bit about Brexit, but first I want to come back to you, Benjamin, and ask. I mean, you're giving a rosy view. And it certainly is an amazing political accomplishment. If nothing else, I think we can all agree that Emmanuel Macron is a political genius of some kind for getting so many people into the National Assembly a year after starting, not even a year after starting En Marche. But there was also a very low turnout by French standards especially the Assembly elections, not the presidential. So how do you see that, and is that of concern, or is this just, you made people vote 4 times in the space of 2 months, what do you expect?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think clearly there's a sense that the French want to give him a chance, but this is sort of a last shot. I don't know what this election would have been without Macron had Le Pen been against Fillon or Benoît Hamon.
Yeah.
But you have seen, obviously, a growing disenchantment with French politics among the electorate. I mean, if you look at the raw numbers, for example, of the National Front over the last 20 years, Le Pen in 2012 got exactly the same number of votes as her father in 2002. But the share of the electorate has always been growing because of the collapse of turnout for other parties. This is also what happened at the parliamentary election. The parliamentary election, basically the people who voted for Macron at the presidential election showed up to confirm. A few socialists, a few Republicans said, let's give him a chance, but mostly they did this by not showing up. Okay. Which sort of means that they just didn't want to save incumbent parties. Like, what's the point of saving parties that have completely failed, or in the case of Republicans that have been unable to unplug a candidate who was so spectacularly corrupt in the midst of his campaign. But clearly, I think it shows that the margin, or the window is going to be very narrow to reform, and the French won't be very patient for him to accomplish what he has to do.
Okay. Alexandra, if you could tell us, what should we take away from the most recent British elections? I have to admit that they've left me somewhat puzzled. How much is Brexit a factor in that? And I take very much what Benjamin has said about the way it was, the Remain argument was made in a very technocratic way, if not in the way of campaign fear. So is that still hanging on there? Are we seeing the after effects of that in this election? Or is it just some of the things that were cited, like the Prime Minister's campaign style? I mean, what do you think about this election?
Okay. Well, thank you. The first thing I will say is I think it's incredibly dangerous speculating about anything these days in European politics. We've all got it wrong many times, including me several times recently on the British election. So I think with that caveat, I will say I think the recent election in the UK tells us very clearly, as this poll also does, that the UK remains deeply divided over the issue of Brexit. And you only have to look at the fact that the referendum a year ago was 52 versus 48%. And this recent poll shows 48% of Brits think that leaving the EU will be a good thing, and 44% think it'll be a bad thing. That 4% gap remains very, very close. So I think it shows us that the UK remains very divided. Was Brexit a factor in the election? I would say yes and no. Yes, in that if you drill down on the voting patterns in the election, and if you correlate it with this poll, what was very interesting for me in the poll was that two of the areas where Britain was clearly an outlier, one was the age gap between older and younger voters. The vast majority of younger voters had a more favourable impression of the EU versus older voters. And one of the factors that appeared to have played in this election is younger voters coming out in more numbers for the Labour Party. The second issue where the UK has a very strong difference from the rest of the EU is the degree of the ideological divide between left and right on attitudes towards the EU. In the UK, if you're on the left, if you identify as being on the left, you're more likely to have a favourable view. So the fact that Labour did relatively better and the Conservatives did relatively badly. So that is mirrored in the way the election results came out. So if you look at the pattern of voting in the UK, I think that mirrors the ambivalence in attitudes towards the EU, whether you're on the left or the right or young and old. On the other hand, the election didn't really take us any further forward on what kind of Brexit British voters want. There was very, very little substantive debate in the election campaign on what kind of trade-offs might be necessary, what kind of deal might realistically be achievable. The Conservatives were still largely campaigning on Brexit means Brexit and we're going to make a success of it, without really delving into the details of where there might need to be trade-offs. And the Labour Party was much more positive in its rhetoric and its tone on the EU, but again, pretty vague on the details. So I don't think the election took us any further forward on what kind of Brexit we might be looking at, let alone what kind of strategy might get us there. For me, one of the biggest surprises of the election was the fact that, despite the fact that 48% of British people voted that they wish to remain in the EU, that was not reflected in the election result. The Liberal Democrats, who were the one party that very clearly said they were willing to hold a second referendum, did not do very well. It doesn't look like the Brits want to rerun the referendum. What analysts have thought is that the results of the election increase the voices of those who are in favour of a soft Brexit. On the other hand, it also, with a small majority, it also makes Theresa May's government very vulnerable to attacks, whether on the left or on the right. So she's on very shaky ground. So it also increases the possibility of there being no deal at all. When I was thinking about what to say at this panel, a thought that came into my head is the Tennyson poem about the charge of the Light Brigade, which talks about there being cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, and cannon in front of them, and into the Valley of Death rode the 600. Just on the metro on the way here, I checked that I'd got the quote correct, and I was interested to find a verse before that, which said, forward the Light Brigade was a man dismayed, not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. But theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die, into the Valley of Death rode the 600. So I kind of feel we're sort of in uncertain terrain on that one. And then I'm glad you made that point about the values, because you'd earlier said you wanted to ask about why is the UK different?
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons the UK is different, and again, what's really striking for me from this poll, is even though many of the people who were surveyed said they shared similar concerns about migration and trade and wanted their governments to have more control, they all still want to remain in the EU. None of them go the next step of the UK, which is to say, well, we're going to leave the EU. And I think there is a difference in the UK, which is, for the UK, it has been not a sentimental relationship. It's been very much a pragmatic relationship. And the Brexiters have always argued we went in on what we thought was an economic union. We were not in favour of this political union. And I won't take up time now, but there's a lot of history on that. And we're an island. So I'll leave it there.
All right, very good. Let me turn to Dan Freed. Dan, when you're looking at this poll, you're a longtime Europe hand. How would you see this from the perspective of a U.S. policymaker? Does this give you hope? Does this make you think that Europe can be more active and look out for itself? Or are you not convinced at this point?
Well, the difference between policymakers and analysts is, I'd put it this way. An analyst looks at the glass half empty and tells you you're doomed. A policymaker looks at the glass and says, well, okay, it's cracked, the water's leaking out, but I can work with this. I'll put a rubber band around it, I'll put some scaffolding, we can deal with this. A policymaker has to deal with impossible, awful situations where one foot on a banana peel, the other on a roller skate. So that news, the Pew News and the news in the Pew Report about NATO and support for NATO rising on both sides of the Atlantic gives us something to work with. So it's much better than the glass which is falling apart and leaking. We have something to work with if we understand that we have to actually work the issues. There's a lot in that poll that suggests the underlying problems, the political problems in Europe are there.
Yeah.
They are mirrored by similar problems in the United States. But Macron shows how creative political thinking can actually work with that environment, and reasonably successfully, at least so far. One of the issues that strikes me is the notion of the nation state. People want their nation to deal with things like immigration and trade, which hit home. Now, in response, that may be caused by a kind of political gap, that Europe does not capture people's guts, it's their hearts. It's still an abstraction even in Europe, which is unfortunate. And that may be a flaw in the design. After 1945, the architects of Europe wanted to make it technocratic because they had seen the results of nationalism. So understandable. And Europe is a fabulous success. Let's not kid ourselves. But in the face of this challenge, I'm looking at two different European responses. Theresa May took all of this desire for the nation state and ran a cautious, conservative, small c campaign. Recognized the power of alienation from Europe, recognized the power of a gap in identity, and play to it. Go for Brexit, validate that, and do so in a reasonable, not a hysterical or extremist way. And she just lost badly. Macron goes for a high-risk strategy. He didn't run an anti-France campaign, but he's basically arguing, and you can correct me, you know far more than I do, he's running a campaign that says, look, I can fix our nation and be a part of Europe at the same time, which is bold and high risk, and everything he touched turned to gold. Now, it's not going to be that way. It's going to be hard. All political careers end in failure. But by the time, along the way, he can accomplish a great deal. And this has interrupted the nationalist narrative and the narrative of some Americans who have been hostile to the European idea and to cosmopolitan values in a way which is pretty sickening. So Macron tells us that politics can fix things if it proceeds from a realistic appraisal of the problems. Fix. In the sense, Macron has a chance now.
Right.
He hasn't fixed the problems, but he has a chance, and he's reassembled the coalition. Now this poll gives us, good news, bad news, and then it's up to the political people to work with that, and it's up to policymakers to support the political leaders.
Right.
So that's actually, bottom line is, it's pretty good news given that it's a miserable set of circumstances we're dealing with.
Right, right. Now you opened the door to this question that I think is the elephant in the room, and I want to start coming out to the audience here, but I want to very quickly go through each of you and ask you about the impact of the United States and the Trump administration on these figures. And Richard, do you have any data or anything like that that shows, or even a gut feeling that shows whether the United States is influential, events in the United States are influential at all in creating these figures?
Why not keep plugging upcoming reports? But we're going to have one very soon on how the whole world sees the U.S. and President Trump, and how Europeans view Trump, and what impact that's had on America's image and the transatlantic relationship. So that'll actually be next week. The one thing we've put out so far would be the NATO report that you've referenced. I thought one of the things that was interesting in that report is that we ask a question in Europe about whether you think essentially the U.S. will come to the defense of a NATO ally if it's attacked by Russia. Essentially, will the U.S. live up to its Article 5 commitments? And we didn't really see a change in that question this year, which I thought was interesting, given all the debate about Article 5, given Trump's comments about Article 5. We nonetheless didn't see a big drop in terms of the percentage of Europeans saying they thought the U.S. would live up to that NATO commitment.
So the data so far, until next week, shows...
But stay tuned until next week.
We'll have a lot
on it then.
Okay. Benjamin, there were some who argued that President Trump and the United States, having elected him, kind of made it more possible that Marine Le Pen would do well.
I think at the end of the day, it was mostly a French election on French issues. It is true that Marine Le Pen was clearly riding the same kind of populist wave, populist message than Donald Trump. As mentioned. And I think Macron himself didn't make some of the mistakes that Hillary Clinton made by being the change candidate rather than the establishment candidate. I think Brexit served much more as a cautionary tale than the Trump election did for the French voters, for European voters down the road. But to take a broader perspective quickly, on the Trump effect on Europe, in a way, it's an amazing opportunity for Europeans. There was a lot of panic almost in Washington when Angela Merkel made that statement after the NATO summit saying, it's time for us to be autonomous and realize that we can't rely on other people. Yeah. But this shouldn't be, we shouldn't react that way. We should actually embrace the fact that Europeans want to get their act together. I completely agree with Ambassador Fried that we are at the turning point at the end of this Jean Monnet technocratic moment. We've transferred powers, technical powers like currency, border control without the political authority for it, and hoping that down the road it would lead to a common identity, to convergence of political interests and political visions. And it worked for a few decades. It worked in an extraordinary way, but now we're seeing the limit of it in the face of the challenge, the migration challenge, in the face of Russian assertiveness. So it is the time to really recreate politics at the European level. I think we have a convergence of factors that create an unprecedented opportunity for this, and maybe the Trump administration is one of them.
Okay. Alexandra?
So I think Britain's had a pretty horrid few weeks. And I would say that there were some tweets by President Trump that had a very immediate effect on sentiment, but not because they changed the debate, but because they reinforced existing perceptions about the political parties. And the tweets I'm referring to are the tweets criticising the London mayor for how he was handling the terrorist attacks in London. And that really hit a lot of people very, very hard. It landed very, very poorly. And the way the parties reacted to it was very different. The Conservative leader, the Prime Minister, who is trying to create a relationship with the US in the context of Britain's wider needs on Brexit, was very cautious and careful not to critique those too much. Jeremy Corbyn, who I think was not expected to win, was very free in his criticism. Mm-hmm. So it reinforced a perception that was already there. Which had already happened when President Trump said he was not going to, that the US would back out of the Paris Climate Accord. And again, Theresa May was the only major European leader to choose not to sign a letter publicly criticising that, but privately had a phone call with him to express her concern. And Theresa May took a gamble and a risk in coming very early to Washington and inviting the president to make a state visit to the UK, which some reports, if they're to be believed, may now quietly be shelved. I think it's fair to say the president is not that popular in the UK, and where he is popular is, for example, on the more right, where vote support for UKIP collapsed in this election. So I think it was a factor, but I think it was playing into existing perceptions and trends.
And you don't think that, for example, the president made clear early on that he was interested in a bilateral UK-US free trade agreement. Does that win him any points in Britain, or is that so far away that the tweets about Sadiq Khan are really much more relevant in this context?
I think they're much more relevant. For Brexiters, the most committed Brexiters, it's extremely important to preserve that relationship with the US, and the hope of a new free trade agreement with the US is an important message to show the British people, see, we do have options, right. We can make a success of Brexit. Once we're free of the EU, we'll be able to negotiate. So that support from Donald Trump is incredibly important. But I think the UK has been going through a very emotional time. And it was a very raw reaction, I think, to those tweets.
Right. Dan, if you were back in your policymaking world, how would you handle this? What do you see as the cost of what I'm hearing is certainly not a closeness in the relationship, but rather the relationship being used, or concerns at least about the president being used for political gain in Europe in a different way?
Oh.
What did you think about the Merkel comment about time for us to not rely on anyone?
I think the French and the Germans are trying to harness the anti-Trump visceral energy and put it to constructive use. Now, I contrast this with what Chirac and Schroeder did, fighting with Bush, without getting into the merits of the Iraq War.
Right.
I think that the Iraq War was for them, I think, an excuse for the more reflexive kind of continental European posturing against the United States. This is different because they were dealing with a genuinely hostile element in one part, not the whole.
Right.
Not even the responsible part of the U.S. administration, but kind of one part of the ideological wing of the administration was hostile. And they were playing against that in a context where Europe itself was under challenge from within. And the challenge from within, from nativists and nationalists inside Europe, was much stronger than the challenge, the problem of one part of the Trump administration. But I think instead of going down a destructive path, they went down a more constructive path of using that energy to try to restore a sense of European momentum.
Right.
And that's, as an American, it's uncomfortable to say the least, to see my country inadvertently causing this, but then at least it's being put to good use, and we are not being written out.
No.
It's as if the message is, the Americans have wandered off into the wilderness, they'll be back, but until they are back, we're going to do what we have to do. Now, I have to say, in defense of this administration, Secretary of State, Defense, and many professionals on the NSC staff are doing their best to keep things together.
Yes.
And watch what they do, not what they say. I think a lot of key and important policies are being, there's more continuity than the Trump administration would admit to.
We have, for example, additional funds going into the European Reassurance Initiative. And
well, that's one big thing,
so
and the Trump administration today rolled out additional maintenance sanctions on Russia, very similar to what the Obama administration was doing, and it was strong. It was not watered down. Right. It was pretty much the same level. A lot of work went into those. So I think Benjamin Haddad is right. I think that there was a playing against the challenge coming from the Trump administration, but not in an opportunistic way. No. Almost a sense, my God, we've got to do something. And Trump, inadvertently, some elements of the Trump administration provided an opportunity. And I think the analysis of the British dynamic was spot on.
Yeah.
I think Theresa May came to Washington and did what British prime ministers have been doing for 2 generations, that is, trying to civilize the Americans. And she did a very good job on a lot of issues.
Yes.
Full credit. But she paid a price. And that's too bad. She didn't deserve it because she was trying to do the right thing.
Right, right. So let me now open this to the audience. Great. Do we have microphones somewhere? Okay, let's get the woman in blue in the middle there, and then way in the back.
Hi, Dr. Katarzyna Pisarska. I'm the director of the European Academy of Diplomacy in Warsaw, Poland. Nice to meet a lot of my friends here. I'm just for a very short visit, so I'm happy to see that Washington is again full of energy about Europe, and it's a hot topic. That's good news for everybody. But then my question is regarding the research we've seen on what the people expect in Europe from Europe and from the EU itself. And I find it particularly worrying that so many people actually say that trade should go back to nation states. I mean, trade has been with the European Commission since the 1960s. It's not a new development. It's been there, for decades, and it seems that the majority of our populations don't realize them. That's just like a revelation that comes out. We have not had trade ministries since we've entered the European Union. Also, the fact that people are willing to limit inter-EU migration. Yes, that's what happened in the UK. That was the main reason. So what do you think this research, and I hope I know it reaches Brussels, and I know it's discussed in Brussels also today, but what kind of implication do you think it should have for the EU project? Should it have, or should we actually start focusing on educating people about what the EU has been doing, and that the consequence of these actions is actually greater prosperity for Europe, not less prosperity? And what would it mean to have less competence for the EU in trade, in internal migration, and so on and so forth?
So let me just also note that the mandate for the European Commission when any trade negotiations are taken forward is first approved by the Council, which is all the member states, and the final agreement is also approved by the Council, as well as being approved by the European Parliament. But it's also true that a lot of Europeans don't realize that. And I'd like Richard to get your thoughts, because I think she's brought up 2 points on immigration and trade where I looked at your figures and I'm thinking, well, not only is it the length of time, but each European country, if asked to negotiate its own trade agreement with the United States, for example, will get clobbered because they're much smaller than the market of 50 million. But how do you reconcile that, the facts, if we can put it that way, with polling data, which is somewhat askew to that? How do you deal with that, and what do you think it suggests?
Sure. Well, I think as you suggest, some of these results probably reflect the fact that people aren't, terribly familiar with all the different responsibilities of the European Union and what policy issues they have jurisdiction over versus others. But people do make some distinctions between issues, right? They very much want their own countries to have control over migration issues, more so than over trade. But in part, I think what these types of questions just tap into are things that we've seen in different ways in our data over time, which is just the distance people feel between themselves and Brussels. We've asked questions about political efficacy. Do you think that people in Brussels listen to your concerns and things like that? People obviously feel very out of touch with Brussels. So in part, that's what these questions and what these responses are tapping into, is that sense of distance and wanting to pull more responsibilities back home. So some of it's about a particular policy area. Some of it's just about this general disconnect between my country and Brussels.
Yes, Dan.
I agree with especially the last part of what you said. I think the issues of immigration and trade have to do with people's sense of alienation, both economically, because of economic disruptions. That's especially true in Poland. Disruption in a good sense, but uneven growth, and sense of national identity in the face of high immigration. I don't think it's an issue so much of relative competencies of the EU versus the nation state, but a sense that people are losing control over what matters to them, and a sense of disruption, which means if you're trying to deal with that, work on economic growth and have the EU delivering for people. Now, in Poland, the EU is somewhere between astonishingly and overwhelmingly popular because it helps people and people are aware of it. But I think these other issues indicate a kind of subtext of political alienation, which can be dealt with, but I don't think what people say is literally what's bothering them. That's just a guess. I'm not sure, but I sense it.
Let me come to Benjamin and then Alexandra.
No, I completely agree with this impression of losing control, and I think once again, when you transfer authority or competencies at the EU level, the problem is, especially when it comes to migration, is there was the impression not so much that it's a problem that the EU was controlling immigration, but more that it wasn't controlling it, that no one was in charge. And it is true that in 2015, the EU did a fairly bad job at seeing the refugee crisis coming, even though you could read so many reports, so many think tank analysis, so many voices were emerging saying there's a looming refugee crisis. You had thousands of people who were dying in the Mediterranean, and it took the crisis to be real and 1 million people to cross European borders for European leaders to take note and start putting measures. Now, there is a problem of communication also and education of the public, as you said. I'm not sure most Europeans know about the greater resources and means that have, and greater mandate of Frontex, of the Border Patrol Agency that have been announced, and the fact that actually now the floors are under control. But I think the priority is to at least make these instruments effective, and because otherwise the legitimate public response is to say, well, let's bring it back at the national level, whereas actually it made sense, it was working.
I would also say that in terms of immigration, one of the things that occurred to me was that if you asked a Greek and an Italian, how has the EU failed you? It would be by not getting rid of these people who are coming through. But if you ask a Pole, it would be by foisting people on Poland. So there are different explanations that the data just can't handle. But Alexandra, Britain is the country that decided it was seriously losing control, and the public took steps. Do you find this resonates?
Well, the thing that I would, just to sort of throw a different note into the debate, is what if the EU actually did address this freedom of movement issue? What if they had actually been prepared to recognise that this was a growing sentiment across Europe, and that the UK was prepared to take it to the extreme of then leaving the EU, which I personally am very sad about. I think there's someone from the British Embassy here. Please don't quote me on that. I mean, why is the EU so reluctant to address this head on, that there is a real concern about the way freedom of movement is operating, both within the EU and externally? And the EU can come up with measures to try and control the migration, but we are facing unprecedented challenges. And if the EU creates fortresses around itself, does it lose the values on which it was also founded? So I think this is a huge crisis for the EU. And the poll does reveal that there is a rebound in support for the EU, but it also reveals real anxieties about how the EU is handling all these challenges. And for me, it's just a terribly sad missed opportunity that David Cameron was not able to negotiate a deal with the EU, because some of the sentiment that drove Brexit in the UK does exist in other parts of the EU. And of course, if you are a keen supporter of the EU, you hope that Emmanuel Macron will galvanise and re-energise this project. But there's no disguising the deep divisions across the EU on a whole host of issues. There are countries that think the solution is more EU, and there are countries that think it is less. So, and those haven't been reconciled.
And divisions within countries.
Absolutely.
Let's go to back there, the last row.
Hi, I'm Nana Sajaya from the Voice of America Georgian Service. It's journalism 101 not to ask two questions at the same time, but I cannot resist the temptation. The first question would be, in the polls, if there is any data about perceptions of Russia, how Russia is perceived in those countries that you did your survey on. And the second question would be about NATO or European enlargement, because in Georgia, let's say, for example, NDI data, recent NDI polls show that support for Georgia's NATO membership is under 80%. But when it comes to the membership itself, only 1/3 of people see it forcible in their lifetime. So I wonder how Europeans see it, either EU enlargement or not NATO enlargement, how it is shown in your data. Thank you.
Do you have any data on that in this or the NATO poll or others?
Yeah, we don't have anything anything recent on NATO enlargement. We have seen a little bit of resurgence in terms of support for NATO over the last few years, over the last year in Europe and in the United States as well. And we've seen some growing concerns about Russia on both sides of the Atlantic as well. And you asked about views towards Russia. Our polling has shown negative views towards Russia, negative views towards Putin, in just about all of the EU countries that we've surveyed.
Next week, this poll that you said was coming out,
Yeah.
you have one poll that asks about the trust that different constituencies have in certain world leaders.
Yeah.
Is that what's coming out next week?
We will have something on that, yeah.
And will President Putin be listed there? Should we look for data?
Yes, he'll be in there too. So I can't tell you what it says yet.
Okay.
But yeah,
okay.
he'll be there.
Okay. Anyone else on the panel want to speak to that? Can I ask if Emmanuel Macron's election, does it say anything about the French attitude towards enlargement at all?
Towards EU enlargement?
EU enlargement, or is this just, there's so many reforms on the table that...
I don't think he has spoken about this. There's generally a pretty large consensus among the French foreign policy establishment against NATO and EU enlargement at this stage. At the time it was the Sarkozy and Merkel who blocked accession to Ukraine and Georgia. And I don't see him, at this stage when there's, as you said, so much to do at home. I don't think he's going to change attitude on this.
Okay. Some more questions. I saw some hands up earlier. Yes, there.
So my question has
Please
to...
identify yourself, though.
Oh, hello, I'm Rosie. I am currently with Legal Placements. My question has to do with what everyone touched upon with migration, where in addition to a governance crisis, it's also a major human rights crisis. So I wonder if any solutions you've thought of or heard discussed reference both the human rights dimensions as well as the anxieties of Europeans and how to assuage both of those.
So it seems to me that we have, I think you said a looming crisis or a more imminent crisis. And of course, the EU has been trying to make some arrangements with African countries and with Libya, although it's been very difficult to figure out with whom in Libya. Europe still does see boatloads of people leaving the African coastline. So to me, it's, every weekend there are fatalities. So how does Europe start to reconcile with these concerns about immigration that you're seeing in your polls? Even Chancellor Merkel has kind of walked back her welcoming attitude with the human rights of the individuals who are getting on these not seaworthy boats and being rescued. I mean, there are not many choices, but on the same time, how do you reconcile that politically? Do you have any?
I think that's the question that European leaders have been asking themselves for the last few years. To be very blunt and cynical, I mean, it's been clearly addressed in a way that puts human rights dimension, at the bottom of the priorities. If you look at the deal with Turkey,
yeah.
I mean, which has been one of the pillars of the solution to stem the flow of refugees. Clearly, it's a sort of realist approach to the refugee issue. So I don't think there's a lot of political appetite in Europe at this stage for integrating more refugees or accepting vast flows of refugees. It will maybe change with the improvement of economic situations. But once again, I think it's a very complicated question. There has been, I think, emerging agreement and consensus to enlarge the mandates of the European Border Patrol Agency to at least proceed to rescue operations. But apart from this, I think clearly the idea of not alienating European citizens over this has been at the forefront of priorities.
Yeah, I would just add, we did some polling last year that highlighted what we think we all know, which is that the refugee issue is just a major, major concern among European publics across the board. And they were concerned about the links between refugees and, in their minds, crime, an economic component to the refugee issue, and then the number one concern was links between, in their minds, the refugee issue and threat of terrorism. So they saw it in security light as well. And as you can see from the data we've got this year, that remains an issue that they're unhappy about in terms of how the European Union is dealing with it.
Right.
Can I just add
yeah.
a thought on that? I mean, the real way to address the refugee issue is to try and resolve the situation in the countries from which they're coming from. And what's been surprising to me is there hasn't been more of a debate, a visible debate, about whether there's a role for the EU and NATO to be more muscular or more active or more engaged in trying to enhance security in the local, in North Africa and in Syria. And what we're seeing, there was a fantastic speech by the former former Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, saying the price of doing nothing is this refugee misery and challenge to our societies. And failure to take action has its own consequences. And I think we're seeing the failure to address much earlier on the crisis in Syria.
Right. Can I get a microphone up here? And then we'll go over to you.
Herb Rose, considering the number of incidents of terrorism in Europe and the refugee problems, has there been any increase in an appetite for either revising or revoking the Schengen Agreement?
Who would like to speak on that? Because I think there's some of the border controls that were put on temporarily still remain, although the Commission has said it's time to stop, but they still remain. But do you sense that there is any further, in France, for example, any further appetite for even more closures of borders than we're seeing now?
Well, I mean, there is appetite, as the data has shown, on this issue for countries to get back national control. I think, at least among the elite, there's a sense that that would be an economic mistake. I mean, beyond the symbolic dimension of going back on one of the main accomplishments of the European Union, it would also be economic mistake. But as you said, actually the Schengen agreements are fairly flexible on this and allow for countries to put back temporary, and temporary is very loosely defined border patrol, which you have now, between France and Belgium, between France and Germany. So you still have free-flowing citizens. You don't need a visa to go from a country to another. You can just settle as the agreements allow, but you do have some sort of control.
Yeah. Let's go over here.
Hi, Graham Scott, the European Parliament Liaison's Office. Ambassador Hall and Ambassador Fried both mentioned European identity, the lack thereof, especially within the UK. Does Pew Research or others have polling data, current polling data on European identity?
We don't have anything current. We took a stab at that a few years ago with a couple of questions, and it showed at the time, at least, that national identity, as you might expect, far outweighed European identity. I think Germany was the one place that stood out, maybe in terms of having the highest degree of European identity among the countries we studied. But it would be a great question for us to go back to more in the future. So that's all we've got from a research perspective.
I think an effort to strengthen European identity and identification of citizens with Europe rather than their own countries is futile and probably harmful. But I think the answer lies in Europe developing and encouraging a kind of dual-level identity. And I think the polling that I've seen suggests that Europeans are comfortable saying, I am French and European, I am German and European, I am Polish and European. What that means in terms of political authorities, I can't predict, but I think there is going to be, or there should be, an effort to develop more of a democratic political legitimacy for the European institutions along with the nation state. And what I mean by this specifically is the European Union still treats choosing its leaders as an inside bargaining process for appropriate to multinational organizations.
Yeah.
There haven't been European leaders who've tried to develop European-wide political constituencies in addition to their own. There are a few of them, I suspect, who would have tried. I think Poland's Radek Sikorski was thinking about this, and maybe Carl Bildt, and they might have done a pretty good job of it. I think that the first European leader who tries to develop constituencies beyond his or her individual nation will be onto something. And I think Macron was running as a French leader, but with a European calling, a European vocation. Now that's interesting. He was doing it from the nation state up, so to speak. I think there may be room for someone to do it from the EU down. It'll be curious to see how it happens. So great politicians are those who break the rules and discover new ways of approaching politics, which is another way of saying new ways to capture people's imagination. So I think that that's just interesting. And it's a vacuum, and vacuums tend to be filled eventually, I hope.
Anyone else want to comment on this? European identity. I mean, I would just say that there has been, through the European Parliament process in the elections last year, the attempt to get political parties to become more than just national political parties through the party groups. I don't think it has caught anyone's imagination except the imagination of politicians. So I think there is a very long way to go. Yeah. I'd be very interested to know which party group En Marche will join, or whether they will have their own party group.
No, I agree. I mean, paradoxically, the one group that has really sort of shaped the conversation at the European level with a certain coherence have been the populists, have been the anti-Europeans, including at the European Parliament. I mean, Nigel Farage's most famous speeches were at the EU Parliament against Herman Van Rompuy, the president of the European Council of the time. Marine Le Pen was a member of the European Parliament. They've tried to create a group that they failed. But paradoxically, they have brought the conversation at the European level with a lot of ideological consistency beyond national borders. Very few pro-European politicians have managed or even attempted to do this. You mentioned a few. I think there was Daniel Cohn-Bendit, also the Franco-German, who did this quite successfully. He did try to have actually Euro-wide green lists. But at the end of the day, I think it really depends on political leadership. It really depends on people. And the problem we have at the European level, as you said, is the way the leaders are chosen is more linked to bargaining and lowest common denominators, and sometimes, let's be honest, explicitly choosing very shallow figures so they won't be problematic for member states. I was in 3 or 4 years ago. I was in Dublin at the EPP summit when Jean-Claude Juncker was chosen over Michel Barnier as the main candidate for the EPP. His candidacy was mostly pushed by Angela Merkel. I mean, he wasn't chosen because of his political clout at the European level and his ability to make the Commission a real political heavyweight. Quite the contrary, to be frank. And it's true. I mean, you did mention that the last European parliamentary elections had this system where the majority party would then get the majority at the Commission, or at least would get the Commission president. But I don't think a lot of people noticed.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's time for us to come to a close, but I want to do one last thing, and that is to ask our panelists, when we gather here a year from now with the next Pew report, will we have seen a retrenchment? Will this have been a pleasant bubble? Or will we see Europe en marche? So is this the beginning of a trend? Have we turned the corner, or are we still waiting for the verdict to come in? What do you think?
Well, I hate to make predictions, but I think one thing I'll look out for, though, in next year's data would be, following up on something Benjamin said, which is, is there this new dimension sort of opening up in ideological space in a way, right? Is the left-right continuum no longer able to sort of adequately describe ideology in Europe or elsewhere? And is there some sort of open-closed dimension opening up? Arguably Macron was able to take advantage of that. So, we've seen energy on the left in Europe, and in lots of ways over the last couple of years, we've seen energy on the right. If you look at our data, on Marsh, Five-Star Movement has particular appeal in the center. So, is there something new happening in terms of a new dimensioning opening up? And as a pollster, that's really interesting. That means we got to ask new questions about it, figure out how to measure it. So I want to look to see what that looks like a year from now.
Right.
I think there is reason to be optimistic. I think clearly, we're seeing at least a sort of comeback from pro-European liberals who have learned the lesson of the last few years, who know now how to shape the message and the political offer. And Macron can maybe create a precedent. But let's be honest, it's not only about narrative; it's also about results. Yeah. And clearly, if I just talking about France. Now all eyes are on what he's going to do in the next few months, his ability to reform the labor market, to really deliver, because otherwise French voters will be unforgiving. I think he remembers how quickly he has emerged in the French political scene, and that can happen against him next time. And so I think the momentum will depend largely on this.
And Britain will be halfway to the Brexit goalposts.
So, I'll comment more on the UK angle. But if the Brexit negotiations go well, then it might improve attitudes towards the EU, but it will also prove the Brexiters right, that it was possible for the UK to have its cake and eat it. So it won't necessarily mean people changing their mind about Brexit, but it might mean there's a better relationship with the EU. If the negotiations go badly, and conversely, if Britain is seen as getting quite a good deal, that doesn't, then for others in the EU who may be thinking of following the same path, there's a trap in that, of course. If the negotiations go badly, it may lead to some people thinking perhaps Brexit wasn't such a good idea, but I also think they will blame the EU for putting them in this position. It will sour attitudes towards the EU. Okay. So I think the UK will look at it very much through the prism of Brexit rather than what's actually happening on the continent.
Right. Dan? Final word.
Much will depend on the economy. If the European economy grows and if the current more optimistic projections turn out right, I think Macron will have more running room. That will strengthen his honeymoon period. He will be able to work with Merkel, and the biggest issue that divides them, which is austerity, German style versus the French growth. If that doesn't wreck their budding partnership, then I think in another year we'll see this positive trend continuing.
All right.
And now, I'm fated to have to eat I may have to eat my words, but I'll stand on that for now.
Well, at least you didn't promise to eat your most recent book, as one political analyst did in the UK and did have to eat his book after the election on prime television.
Don't promise anything.
So never promise
my advice.
So at any rate, thank you all for joining us. I think we've had a very good and thorough discussion of an excellent report, yet again, by Pew. And we look forward to next week's poll.
Absolutely.
And also to next year's poll. So thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks.